I'm Alan Wartes, and this is ThinkRadio Presents ThinkPeople. I'm joined today by artist, printmaker, educator, and former Peace Corps volunteer Seth Roby.
I had an aha moment definitely with printmaking, and anybody who understands that process, it is definitely sort of like a Zen process where you're doing several things, but once again it slows you down. It's not a mechanical sort of process where you have a few machines, but these machines haven't changed since the late 1400s or so when they came about, and there was sort of an affinity for that for me.
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio. If you like Think People, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think Business, a weekly discussion with entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors on sustainable business into the 21st century. Think Planet, conversations with thought leaders on important environmental issues. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. I'm joined today by artist, printmaker, educator, and former Peace Corps volunteer Seth Roby. He has an MFA in printmaking from New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and he currently teaches at Helena College and Carroll College in Helena, Montana. Roby will be the first to tell you that his passion is creating art for anything that goes through a printing press. I'm using his words. Most recently, that means he's been working on a collaboration, creating beautiful handcrafted, hand-printed books with writer and poet Aaron Parrott. He and I have a lot in common and a lot to talk about today. So with that, Seth, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Alan, for having me.
You know, I'm struck immediately. You're a young person. Clearly, you grew up in the world that is shifting so powerfully toward digital media,
right?
Digital art of all kinds. And yet, here you are making these beautiful handcrafted pieces of art. Talk to me about that. What is it about slow art like this that appeals to you?
You know, it's interesting. I've been talking to a lot of students these past couple of days, just being around campus again, and a lot of them asked me, it's like, why printmaking? How'd you get into even that? And there was that. I had an aha moment definitely with printmaking, and anybody who understands that process, it is definitely sort of like a Zen process where you're doing several things, but once again it slows you down. It's not a mechanical sort of process where you have a few machines, but these machines haven't changed since the late 1400s or so when they came about, and there was sort of an affinity for that for me. I can honestly say I've never taken a graphic design course, and
how'd you manage that? Get all the way through college?
I know, yeah. You'd think I was great at forging signatures of professors or something.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, but somehow I skirted around that, and I really enjoyed that sort of that handcrafted, and I talk about it in my thesis all the time now. It's like I love to see the artist's hand in the work. I love to get back to just that, and I don't see it as trying to be like countercultural at all. It's just that maybe I grew up a little bit about sort of these handmade machines. I grew up in Montrose, working kind of on a farm and stuff, and things were a little bit more manual. And I don't know, there was a sort of an affinity towards that for me. And I think maybe that kind of resonates still in my working process, where just kind of slow it down and, just make a few. You don't have to make thousands. I still want people to be able to appreciate that. And
yeah. Well, that would probably be difficult to make thousands, right? I mean, the process itself limits the number that you can.
It is true. It is true. Some people like to sort of push those limits, but I'm interested in getting just a few good copies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and just to be clear, printmaking is. Describe that to us, so people who aren't familiar with what that is.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, because the print itself is so digital now. You think like, oh, a Xerox machine or something, and or you can just go buy a poster and like that's a print. So what is this printmaking thing? And it's definitely It takes on several different forms. We have, you can make prints with wood blocks, and you can make prints with etchings like copper plates and zinc plates. You can make silk screens. You can make lithos, and all that kind of falls into that genre of print making. Some would even say that old photography and kind of working in the darkroom is a form of print making, right? Where you're getting your hands in on that. So, but I guess the way I define it as is sort of like an artist's individual expression that, once they put it in that printing press, whether it's an old Gutenberg style or you got two cylinders that are smashing that paper and block together, they're allowing this sort of transformation to happen. And while it may have traditionally been used to spread, the written language, we've been able to really advance it through this artistic means and kind of continue those traditions of kind of a form of democracy, right? Where we can just get all this information out. Anybody can start making their own and publishing their own.
The printing press has a long history with that, right?
So,
these days, it tends to be more digital media. However, we're learning that digital media can be manipulated.
Absolutely.
But if I print it on a piece of paper in my basement and I go out on the street and start handing it out, the only way to manipulate that is to go confiscate those copies.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's something immediate about that.
Yeah.
But when you, as the artist, set out to make a print, that involves first imprinting your vision on some medium that's not the finished product.
Definitely not.
Right? It's the wood or as you said, the copper or whatever medium you're using. That strikes me as something that is far, far more exacting than, say, if I am working in oil and I'm working on canvas. I can flow with that process.
Right, I can push it a little
bit.
Right,
it can evolve. Man, when you're etching on wood to do a woodcut,
there is a precision to it, right? Like you're, what is that old adage where it's like, you have this like craftsman and somebody walks in and they say, oh, how long did it take you to learn how to do that? Because it looks like, you just whip this out in 10 minutes and they're like, oh yeah, it took 30 years in 10 minutes, that sort of deal. And that's kind of what it is. You have this sort of old, I would say like kind of master and apprentice sort of relationship where you're learning these techniques, you're understanding how to move your hand with the gouge across a piece of wood in order to get that line that you want. But at the same time, the material still is really dictating how that mark is going to look. There's still only so much you can do with each of those mediums. So like in traditional wood blocks, you don't see a lot of sort of like value ranges. You can try to imitate those, but really you're just getting black and white lines to imitate that, where they develop something like lithography, which can look more like a charcoal drawing for that. So each one kind of plays to its own tendencies, which I find very interesting, that for an artist to imprint that sort of emotional response they want, they have to go to a certain form of printing in order to get that, because some just won't dictate it.
Right.
So...
Well, and I'm a fan of both, and you've got examples of both, I think, on your website.
Yeah.
Color blind prints.
Yeah.
And if anyone is interested in seeing more, it's colorblindprints.org.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And at first I had to look really closely because I thought I was looking at charcoal drawings. But they're not, right?
Right.
That amazes me. I mean, how does that work with printmaking to get really fine nuances of shade and value on the page?
Right, and some of that comes down to that lithography process I was kind of mentioning, in that where you're using an oil and water sort of combination, where if you draw with an oil or grease pen across a litho stone, or even now they make plastic plates because stones are so hard and heavy to carry, right?
Yeah.
And so, and what it does is it imitates that charcoal look. It can imitate that hand-drawn look. And then some of the other prints on there, I've recently got into more like some cyanotypes, those sort of things that allow me to create my own sort of photo negatives using newspapers and such. And so I'll get some tonalities that shine through when I expose those papers. So there's a few things on there that allow me my bag of tricks to kind of get back to that value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, So I don't mean to dismiss the value of digital art,
Oh,
because
no,
I'm a big fan of some of the
absolutely.
artists that are working in digital media.
Yeah.
I mean, what some people can do with pixels blows my
Oh,
mind
yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Right. But I want to ask you, in your experience, in what way does the medium that you're working in really define the creative process? And I don't just mean the technique. I'm saying how does it shape and form the finished product, not as a genre of art, but as a piece of art, as an artistic expression? How does medium play a role in that?
Yeah. Boy, I mean, I guess I'll talk to just about me personally. I mean, I think a lot of people can answer that in a lot of different ways. But man, when I choose a medium, like, I know sort of what I'm trying to get out of it already. And a lot of that is, I know that what I want the viewer to end up looking at is something that shows something that's a little bit more raw, something that shows that artist's imprint, that artist's touch, that personal touch to it. And going back to a little bit what you're asking about with that sort of like digital and not trying to knock it, like I too, I'm not interested in trying to degrade it, but I'm not interested in perfection either. I don't really believe that we as human beings are perfect. And so I want my viewer to know that when I pick up a medium, when I'm using that medium, and what is a result of that still has this very like humanistic touch to it. And so that's why I try to use my hands and let sometimes maybe it's a slip of a gouge, or maybe it's a, when I expose a cyanotype or doing something, like something comes through that I have no control over, and that's okay, and like kind of like, just like in life. And that's how I look at a medium, is what's resonating with me best in life. What emotion that I'm trying to get into this piece is best represented with that medium. So I don't know if that gets completely at your want to ads, but
no, it does, and that the kind of art, the kind of image, and therefore the emotion that it's able to evoke in your audience is very much defined by the medium you're working in.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And so that brings me to my impression of printmaking and the prints that come out of that process. They evoke something that's very different from other types of art. It's a kind of nostalgia, and I'm just speaking for myself.
No, but yeah, go.
It's a kind of nostalgia. I mean, these are children's storybooks that I grew up with, but it transcends that. I mean, the subject matter that you in particular choose for your art almost creates this wistful feeling.
Yeah.
Of something it's like a dream that you can't quite remember the next morning. I mean, do you feel that when you look at this art and when you're making it?
Yeah, and I think also what kind of draws into it, and playing a little bit, you talk about your own like children's book illustrations, things like that. There's something about the print that I think has always been tactile. I mean, you have to be very tactile when you're making the blocks. You have to be very tactile with the medium. And then when you're done pulling it, you're peeling it off that stone or that block or something, like the hands and feeling that, and the paper and how heavy it is compared to just a regular, compared to regular Xerox or something, like all of that starts to feed our senses into why we start to enjoy these pieces, these images on these pieces of paper. And working on paper, to me, I solely work on paper for that reason. I don't really work on canvas or anything like that, even though, it's possible. But man, paper is so tactile that I love it. I love it for that reason. And I can remind you of your early childhood illustrations. I think of like a map on the wall, and man, you walk up to it and you start touching it, and those old printed maps, and sort of seeing those lines and being able to trace them with your fingers. I mean, all that sort of stuff is what really brings me into printmaking too.
Well, yeah, I mean, kids start out there.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe kids are consuming more digital media now than they are.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I was in the kindergarten class. I'm trying to think. Yeah, what is it now? I don't know.
Well, you see small children, interacting with a device, but still, still, they love to hold a book in their hand.
Yeah, it's true. We've never been able to get away from it. I remember in grad school, there was a gal who was doing some book arts, and that was one of her biggest critiques. It's like, hey, I got Kindle, I got this. Like, why? And it's like, we still, every time we see that book, there's something with that cover and the way the gold leaf is kind of stamped on it, or it's designed. And when you open a page, to me, one of the coolest things when you open it up and that first section has like, to Susie, Merry Christmas, 1981. You're like, that's awesome. This sort of personal gift. Maybe it's too bad that I have it now, but like I kind of like that page. And as you go through, you can see the margins and you can see where people maybe folded a page or visited a page so much, or unfortunately, some of the pages have detritus of what they ate that day too. So there's this whole recorded history,
marks,
absolutely.
kinds of stuff.
Yeah, little brother got it once, and he got, went across it, and so like all of that is now a part of that book, and it's individual, even though there's maybe millions of them printed out there.
Yeah.
And a lot of my work deals with the individual versus the collective. And people say, well, how do you, you're making prints, you're making, X amount of them. They're not different from one another, but they are. Every single print. I have yet to come across a print to me that is perfect each and every time when it's hand printed.
Really? So the process of printing introduces little variations?
And each one has their own personality to me. So when I look at a streak of prints, when I pull off, like there may be a little bit of a smudge here, or maybe this paper has this little bit of a crinkle. Like there is no exact. So even though we're making what some people may think of like, oh, these are just replicas or one-offs from one another, but they aren't. They are original prints to themselves. They contain their own identity. And, if you, let's say, under ink in an area and it kind of fades, well, that fade can be kind of interesting in the composition that you had no idea about, and it only exists on that one piece of paper. You cannot make that fade happen again, no matter how you try. So I really enjoy, and I let it happen. I just let that be because
you don't toss that one out.
Heck sure. No, heck no. That's a $5 piece of paper. First, no, right. But there's always something to learn from on those too, and so I keep those and let them kind of come be a part of the process. So.
Yeah. When you're looking for subject matter, what catches your eye and why?
I've always been fascinated by like the everyday mundane. I used to sit, one of my things, I'd sit like on a park bench and draw everybody that goes by in the quickest contour line drawing that I could. And at the end of the day, on one piece of paper, I'd have all these lines that kind of didn't make sense. And I liked that. And then I started looking at, I always was more nostalgic at times. So, I started it when I, was drawing. I also first started drawing the downtowns of old towns, and you see the barn art and the drawing the old Chevy truck with weeds growing out of it, that sort of thing. But what I realized within those sort of things is just like, what is our environment? Like, what makes that environment unique? And I realize now that's what inspires me is when I move to a place or I'm living in a new place, like give me a little bit of time and you'll absorb a little bit of that different culture, a little bit of that different taste that makes that place unique to itself. And across the United States, we can think of that. Like, living in Montana, scenery-wise, can look a lot like Colorado, but it is totally different. And I love that. And so that environment to me is really beautiful to explore and let it kind of seep into my pores a little bit. And as I collect my pieces of that environment, then I go back into the studio and sort of regurgitate them onto a piece to make a more semblance of the order and talk about, once again, like what I think is going on around me.
How does the artist really move into a place? How do you go about seeing what's really there? I mean, I've heard it said that art is not so much about seeing what is there. It's about unseeing what you think is there. The prejudices and previous impressions that you bring.
Absolutely. Yeah, I tell my students all the time, like, there's perceived and there's actual, right? And so how do we get our brain to look at the actual?
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. And I think it takes a little bit of time. I think your first impressions are very interesting because there's a lot of truth to them, and yet because you don't recognize everything that's going around, there's a lot of falsehoods about it. And then after a while, I think the best way for me to start to see the community that, like I live in now, is that idea of kind of slowing down, which once again goes back to that printing process. I always think in like, I'm always a part of the community as far as I'm going to jump in, I'm going to greet some people, go to the shops, kind of hear what people are talking about, and just kind of start collecting that information. And to me, that's where I get sort of a greater sense of what's going on or what's kind of driving this area. And I guess I'm just using that analogy now because my Peace Corps experience was kind of that same thing where even if I didn't even speak the same language. So, when you take conversation out of the piece, how do you find out about that environment? And it was usually just kind of going around, sitting, being there, being present, letting people see you seeing people. And eventually you feel those rhythms, right? You start to feel like, okay, what's actually happening?
But the key word I think that you've said, key phrase, is slowing down. Kind of stepping outside of yourself and allowing yourself to even feel what the rhythms are of the place.
Yeah.
And it's good you bring up your Peace Corps experience because that was my next question about understanding a place. You feel that's possible even when the place is very foreign.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all human beings, yeah.
Yeah, and so some of your most compelling art on your website are those images clearly from when you were in the Peace Corps. Where were you?
Oh,
and
yeah.
what were you doing?
My wife and I were stationed in Ghana, West Africa, in a village called Zabzu, which is up in the northern region of Ghana near the Togo border. It's a cool little place. I mean, a little bit of geography there. It's the beginning of sub-Saharan Africa. So you're out of the jungles and you're pretty much into the brush. Ghana is about the size of Oregon, but has 25 million plus in there. So it's highly condensed in those populated areas. But that's where we were stationed, and we were there for 27 months. So yeah, and it was just her and I, and 6 hours away from any American, and and yeah, it was a great time. It was a great time.
And you said you got there without knowing any of the language.
Absolutely, yeah.
How did that work?
Yeah. I mean, that's probably the scariest thing. I remember recruiters talking to me and saying, "Hey, so how are you with language?" And I said, "Oh man, I took Spanish for 4 years, and luckily I can go to the Taco Bell, right?" But but when you're there and you're immersed, and I think this kind of goes back to some of what you're talking about is how do you fit in and how do you feel the environment when you're in that. We are very adaptable creatures, right? Humans, and so. All of a sudden, when your brain shifts and it knows it's like I got to learn this or do this, it'll happen. And the Peace Corps said us, they train you about for 3 months when they first bring you into the country, and so we had a language instructor to get you all into the basics. Hi, how you doing? I want to buy an onion, things like that. Yeah, and
just enough to get in deep trouble.
Just enough, yeah. Oh man, and do you? They find you don't want to at times, but you find it. But.
Well, presumably the Peace Corps didn't send you there to make prints.
No.
What were you doing?
Yeah, this is great. I got sent as a health, water, and sanitation volunteer, which is very interesting. I'm art education background, printmaking background. I had my master's by this time, and I always tell the joke, it's like my wife, I think, looked better on paper for the Peace Corps than I did. And so what they did is they took us both in that program, they put us near school. And so, and there was kind of that like, they'll find their way. And so we did both, but we taught at the school. It was a secondary school, which is a high school level school. And then when I wasn't teaching, we were going village to village and doing education, dealing with women, doing women's groups and sensitization of that, baby weighing, nutrition, condom demonstrations. That's the weirdest thing to do in another language is a condom demonstration.
I can well imagine.
Yeah, you do it a few hundred times, and you're like, why does this feel normal?
Yeah, not something you expected.
Yeah. Not
what your parents really saw for your future.
Yeah. Exactly. How does this translate when I go back to the States? I don't think I can do this.
Yeah. Well, so what made you attracted to the Peace Corps to begin with? I mean, you just finished an MFA in a traditional art form. Why take time out of that trajectory to do this other thing?
Yeah, and luckily, maybe I was young and I understood as an artist there wasn't going to be a lot of opportunities out there. I don't mean to be sort of a Debbie Downer about it, but we all have these sort of hurdles with our jobs once we're done with school. And in the art world, after your MFA, you're either trying to be a professor or you're going to be a studio artist. And I think at that moment, I love teaching, but the job market's very slim for that. So you're going to be doing some adjunct work. And studio art, it's fun making, your work and getting into it. But maybe I didn't feel grounded enough. Like, I do believe that when you have a story to tell or you have this experience that comes out, your artwork is truly enriched. But my wife, she had wanted to do it for a while. And I had a great professor, a mentor at New Mexico State who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia in 1969. His name's Spencer Fiddler, great guy, amazing printmaker. And that was kind of this sort of thing like, wow, I mean, I'm looking at his work. He's a legend in the field, and I think that kind of let me know that, like, hey, you should try something besides art, because you've been doing art and you've been doing the School of Art now for 8 to 9 straight years. So go out and do this. And that kind of gave me the confidence, and so that's where it kind of began.
And there's nothing like experiencing the emotions and the challenges of real life to inform your art. I mean,
absolutely.
Would you say that was true of the Peace Corps experience? That you came back with this different idea of what it is to make art in general? To make art,
what it is to be an American. I said, Peace Corps trims the fat for sure. You can't carry extra stuff around with you. It's too heavy and the buses are overloaded. You're not going to get it on. You yourself will be limited to a diet where you will lose some weight. All those things that you felt like were really important, you find which ones are truly important. So that's what I mean by, trim the fat. And that to me was great for clarity. And then once again, being able to slow down. When you're in a village and you're not going anywhere, you have no transportation, and you will find several things to entertain yourself to help pass the time. But it'll also let you realize it's okay. Just sit down, enjoy this process. You're going to be here 2 years regardless. So observe what's going on, learn what you can, and then that's why I think those pieces came back so enriched more, because I'm super proud of that work, that body of work.
They're very rich. I mean, I would not be surprised if you said to me that those were made by natives, because they seem to capture some ineffable quality, capture the moment really powerfully.
Thank you.
So, well done with that.
And maybe that just speaks to cultural integration and kind of what Peace Corps, that program is. I tell my students, I tell anybody, it's like, if you're kind of struggling, you want to figure some things out, try volunteering somewhere. Maybe it's the Peace Corps, maybe it's AmeriCorps, maybe something. I'm not a spokesman. I wish they'd pay me for this. We could broadcast this. And I get a nickel every time I say Peace Corps.
Yeah, but I've got a nickel for you.
Yeah, thank you. But it changed my entire perception on how it is to create, how it is, like I said, to be an American, how it is to be responsible to your community. So.
Yeah. Well, that segues to another question I have for you. These shows are called ThinkRadio Presents, right? We want to think deeply about what it is to be an American, what it is to be a global citizen, what it is to live resiliently, and so on. And as an artist myself, I'm fascinated with the idea that you can't leave art out of that equation.
No way.
And so my question to you is, in what ways do you think the process of making art, or even learning how to really appreciate it, is key to resilient, responsible living on the planet?
I think this is a question that, any artist, like I think it changes probably every maybe year, 2 years, 5 years, as you think about it. And then, of course, as society defines it. I always tell my students, it is a mark of our existence at first, to be able to do this. It's art to me is one of those factors that separates us from other organisms on the planet, our ability to create. And I know somebody can say, I watched a YouTube video of an elephant paint. And I'm like, yes, you have. But we're talking about conscious creation that feeds in, and creativity. I think that's where this key really gets into the resiliency in our communities. Like when we are creative beings, I think that's when we're as close to our natural existence as possible. Right? We get to do probably what we're most intended to do, because I think we're all creative beings. even if you don't think you can supposedly draw a stick figure, it's like, well, yes, you can, but you're also very creative in other ways. And that to me is when we are creating is when we're probably at our most peaceful. We're probably at our most introspective. We're at probably our most humanistic traits.
Why do you think that is?
Boy, I don't necessarily know completely right now about that, but when we tap into something that we know is about experiencing something outside of ourselves, that it's not completely about us. I know that when I create something, it will be set free in the world. It's supposed to be set free. And I think that's kind of an interesting maybe way of answering that question is that when we create, it is never for ourselves. And knowing that it's going to go to somebody else, I have a responsibility to them to show that, to show my best of my ability, but also to show like whether it's beauty or truth.
Well, and there's this idea that if you don't, then the world loses out because that was a unique creation that wasn't going to come into the world any other way.
Absolutely.
Julia Cameron, who wrote, The Artist's Way years ago, which changed a whole bunch of lives.
Yeah, it's a good book.
She says that the process of making art is less about thinking something up as it is about pulling it down out of the flow that exists outside of you.
Yeah.
Is that
I can agree.
True in your experience?
Yeah, I can agree. I do believe that there's like this idea, oh, no, there's nothing new under the sun. So that idea is like we're not just inventing something completely new.
Yeah.
But we are given a way of reconstructing elements or pieces or materials or something in a way that maybe hasn't been completely fabricated that way before.
Yeah.
But I do like how it explains it. I think it helps us also take away this term genius that we always associate with art and artists. And if some people like, oh, I can't play the guitar, I can't do this, I'm not that genius, I'm not that person. I'm like, man, that is not what this is about.
Not at all.
And we always hear the stories, Picasso or even like the Michael Jordans, right? Like they just always seem to have this natural innate ability. You never hear about them practicing. You never hear about those years before. And it's like, but they're there.
Oh, they're there. Many thousands of hours.
Yeah. So I wish we would use that term a whole lot less.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I do want to talk about bookmaking.
Sure.
You've talked about prints. Those are sort of standalone pieces of art. The project you're involved with Aaron Parrott, that's a collaboration that's not just about your art. Your art is in support of someone else's. What appeals to you about that?
Well, before I was like, as a printmaker, we usually work more collaboratively than maybe other artists do because a studio itself, not everybody can have this press that costs several $1,000s and weighs several thousand pounds. So it's always really been since the tradition of printmaking that people come together in those studios and collaborate. More recently, the prints, as they become more original prints and you kind of just get one of ones, you're getting printmakers that go into the studio and are kind of just by them, like a painter, where they're just kind of really into their own work. And in grad school, I was like that. I wanted to make these things that were more one-on-one. And so this was really cool for me, an opportunity. Aaron and I, we met in Helena, Montana when I worked at an art museum there. And he's like, hey, we should just kind of do some work together. And I said, yeah, whatever. I was like, I got stuff to do. I got to go type up spreadsheets or something, But, it's a small community. So we'd see each other around it. And I did an art show. He's like, man, I got this space that I'm going to rent. I want you to be a part of it. And so we have, by his initiative, what's called the Territorial Press in Helena, Montana. And we just, he had these short stories and he's like, we should do a Kickstarter just to get going with this. And it worked. We got our funding and we did these books and it was 13. It started off as 13 of his short stories that he had written over his career.
Each in a separate volume?
And they were
collected?
they had been published in magazines over time and stuff, but he'd never really put them together. And so he's like, this is my chance. And so we put those together. And then he said, kind of have at it. What do you feel? What do you see when you do this? Just do it. So I made 13 wood engravings to accompany that with the book size and, with self-publishing and stuff. We kind of, we trimmed it down to 10 eventually. But we used an etching, or I used my relief sort of etching press in combination with his letterpress to do all those sorts stories. Some of it's with handset type. which is primarily what we use. We have an extensive collection of old wooden and lead blocks, like 13 tons worth of lead to move around, and that kind of just got us going. But Aaron's amazing because he's this guy who can just like compose at the table, like he's a poet with that lead. He doesn't even write things out, which is kind of cool. Yeah. So he'll slap something together and he'll say, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And I'll throw my interpretation on it, and then soon you go back and forth enough, you got yourself a book, and that's how it happened. I mean, it was kind of by chance.
Also, a very detailed, hand-done procedure. I mean, when you're setting individual letters in a press, that's slow.
Yeah.
Well, they're beautiful, for one thing. What is the project called?
So the first book we did was called Maple and Lead. I was carving out of maple blocks. He was using lead type, so we put that together. The second one that we did was called Thumbprints, and instead of his stories inspiring me, I did 12. I did 12 small wood engravings of the landscape, part of sort of what I was just doing, getting into being at a part of Montana, and they're the size of a postage stamp. So I did these little engravings and I printed them out and said, "Hey, well, what do you think of these?" So he started composing at the table and put these quick little stanzas together, these small poems. I mean, the book itself is probably like 4 by 6 inches. And I ended up hand rubbing them all with my thumb. So we're like, oh, well, let's call this thumbprints because they're also the size of thumbprints. So anyway, yada. And so we threw that together, and we have these small books that we release, and usually they're only about $25 an edition. And so the price, they're maybe a little bit pricier than, like a book like that's $50. But that we sell them out quickly, and we really enjoy that. Get to the next idea, get to that next collaboration. But we hand sew them, we guillotine them there, we hand cut them, we do the covers, everything.
And when you pick up a book like that, you don't pick up the vibe of a mass-producing printing press.
Yeah.
There's an energetic imprint on a book like that. Left by the artist.
Yeah, these artist books, they are getting more popular. But we just love doing it, and that's what has been kind of interesting. I never set out to make books. I never really thought of it, and I like that idea. It lets me respond more as an artist, to be like, once again, more open to these new ideas, and once again, collaboration. I never had collaborated before, but it just kind of works. It just works.
Well, colorblindprints.org. Go see for yourself. These are beautiful pieces of art.
Thank you,
Seth,
Alan.
thanks for the conversation.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.